is just now 6 o'clock. Thank you very much for coming to our police forum this evening, a community conversation on police use of force. Can everybody hear me in the back? Good to go? Okay, so for the purposes of this evening, for obvious reasons, I think part of the national conversation that's going on around the country is police use of force. The events in Minneapolis and some other high-profile events across the country have a lot of people talking about that. And so when something like this happens, one of the things that we like to do at the Leavenworth Police Department is get out and talk to the community about how that might impact us here. It's my favorite thing in the world is to get out and talk to the people of this community about policing, whatever it is that we're talking about. If you let me, we'll ramble on for 6 or 7 hours. Let's try not to do that, okay? I brought with me some police officers. So here's the format for tonight. I'm going to spend about 20 minutes, 25 minutes or so running through, starting from the very basics about how we use force, talk about the Constitution, talk about all of the things that govern our authority to use force, policy and all of that. I'll open up the floor for questions, and then I invited some of our officers down to just hang around for a little while and talk in small groups if you want to do that. Other than that, there's no particular format beyond that. I just want to have a conversation with the community of Leavenworth about use of force. Now, part of that is that there's a lot of discussion in the country about change. We want to talk about some changes that may need to be made in the law enforcement profession. That's okay. We're very open to that. I often tell people that it's not my police department, it's not their police department, it's our police department, all of us. We all have a stake in how effective our police department is. Okay? So that's the point. We'll have another one of these in August at St. Mary's University. Okay? If you love how I speak tonight, come back and hear again. Okay? The point would be we're going to listen to the public, have some discussion with the public, then look internally about whatever things we're hearing are talked about that needs to be changed, and then we'll have some discussion with our elected officials about whether or not those changes need to be made, whether they're reasonable, okay? And make those changes. I fundamentally believe, though, that if we're going to make changes, the changes have to be done in a thoughtful, methodical manner. We can't make decisions based on 1 or 2 bad events that have happened, okay? We have to think about the impact of those changes and how we're going to move going forward with those, okay? That's what I believe. So that's the purpose of this. And I need input, I want input, but I also want the officers here to listen as well. It doesn't do me any good to stand up here and talk if the officers and everybody who have a stake in all of this aren't on board with that. So that's the plan. All right? I hate to do this to you, but it's going to be much like an 8th grade civics lesson for the first few minutes. Okay, I'm going to start at the very beginning, go from there all the way through to the end, and then we'll open it up to questions. Now, if you have a question sometime in the middle, you feel like you need to go ahead and let's do that. But I would prefer that we wait till sort of the end, okay, of my presentation, then we'll kind of go from there. On the table in front of you are a few things that we laid out in advance, one of which is a copy of the PowerPoint presentation. So if you're having trouble looking at it, okay, it's there with you to take a look at. There is a Department Chapter 21, our use of force policy. Those are yours to take with you. Feel free to have that, take that with you. We also have a copy of our comprehensive plan, okay, that I'll talk about. And we also have a blank copy of the department's use of force form that I'll talk about, but I wanted you to have that stuff in front of you as we sort of move through the presentation. All right? Everybody good? All right, let's go. Police use of force is governed by the Constitution. It is governed by U.S. Supreme Court cases, state law, and local policy. Those are the 4 influences that govern what we do. It is the #1 concern of police leadership everywhere that I go, and I talk to my colleagues, other police chiefs and sheriffs across the state. That's all we think about because it's important, it's critical. We spend a tremendous amount of time studying it, reviewing it, understanding it, looking for ways to improve it. Okay? It is 1A of the most important things in my job as chief in our agency. Okay? It's important to understand when you leave tonight this statement. Use of force by the police is not going away. It's not. We can change things, we can try and make it better. Nothing in my nearly 30 years in this business has given me any indication that it's going away. There are people that we are going to need to arrest who are not going to cooperate and are going to resist. We can do everything we can to try and avoid that, but at some point, we reach the precipice. We reach the point of no return, okay? We either make the arrest or we have to get in the car and drive away. It's just that simple, okay? So I don't want you to leave here tonight thinking there's a magic formula or a magic pill or something that we can do that's going to prohibit the use of force. It's just a reality of what we do. Our mission, our objective is to try and do everything we can to mitigate it and to do it as least as possible, but it is not going away. It's just the reality of what we do. So let's get into it. The big one. The Fourth Amendment to the Constitution of the United States is the big one. That's what governs us. The right of people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable search and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrant shall issue, and on and on. I am a certified police officer in the state of Kansas and in the city of Leavenworth. If I arrest you, I am seizing you under the Fourth Amendment. I have seized you. That's how it's evaluated. That's how it's adjudicated. When I make an arrest, and if I use force on you, it must be reasonable. That's how it's determined. Okay? When you say someone violated my rights, that's what they're talking about. They used force. The officer used force on me, and it was unreasonable because it was excessive. All right? That's the first way in which it is governed. There are two big Supreme Court cases that provide police officers with the most guidance on use of force. The first one is Graham versus Connor. It's the big one. In this case, you can Google it and look it up and spend some time reading it if you want. Most importantly, the Supreme Court, the law of the land, provided the law enforcement profession with essentially a four-pronged test. Here is how we are all going to judge whether or not force used by a police officer in an arrest was excessive. Okay? Graham versus Connor. Number one. Let me read it. The factors to be considered in determining when an excessive force use gives rise to a cause of action under 1983. That's a technical way of telling the government that an agent violated my civil rights, my Fourth Amendment rights. Okay? Here's number one. The need for application of force. Why did we need to use force during the arrest? That's first. Okay? Number two, the relationship between that need and the amount of force that was used. Not only why did we need to use force, how much force did we use? Number three, the extent of the injury inflicted. What happened to you if I used force on you? Okay, what was the injury? Did you get a broken arm? Did you get some bumps and bruises? Did I shoot you? What was the injury that was inflicted upon you? And then finally, sort of a catch-all, whether the force was applied in good faith effort to maintain and restore discipline, or maliciously and sadistically for the very purposes of causing harm. A general sort of review of what happened. Okay? Why did I need to use force? The relationship between that need and the amount that was used, the extent of the injury, and then the big giant catch-all. That is what the Supreme Court said we're going to use to evaluate force when a police officer makes an arrest as to whether or not it is reasonable. Got it? That's the big one. The other one, before I get to the other one, I want to talk about some of the additional language in that case that provides some context underlying to that. This is the Supreme Court. The reasonableness of a particular use of force must be judged from the perspective of a reasonable officer on the scene rather than with the 20/20 vision of hindsight. Okay? They said to us and everybody, just because you know what happened, you have now the results of what happened. That doesn't mean it was unreasonable. You have to make the judgment what the officer knew at the time that they made the decision to use force. All right? Okay, understand that? Furthermore, and this is a really, really important part of this, the calculus of reasonableness must embody allowance for the fact that police officers are often forced to make split-second judgments in circumstances that are tense, uncertain, and rapidly evolving about the amount of force that is necessary in a particular situation. They gave us the test, and then they provided us some context. That's the Supreme Court telling us, all of us, how it is that we're going to decide whether or not force was reasonable. All right? The other big Supreme Court case, Tennessee versus Gardner. There's a D in there. There should not be a D. Sorry about that. Typo. The Supreme Court in Tennessee versus Gardner held that laws authorizing police use of deadly force, I'll talk about that in a minute, deadly force, to apprehend fleeing, unarmed, non-violent felony suspects violate the Fourth Amendment. And therefore, states should eliminate them, and by and large, they have. This case has been around for a little while. Okay? You cannot use deadly force to apprehend a fleeing, unarmed, non-violent felony suspect. Okay? That is an absolute violation of the Fourth Amendment. Got that? All right. There is also Kansas law that specifically governs the use of force. I need a drink. Give me a second. That's a lot to read up there. There's an important part of this. It goes on basically to say this. A law enforcement officer, or any person whom such officer has summoned or directed to assist in making a lawful arrest, is important, need not retreat or desist from efforts to make a lawful arrest because of resistance or threatened resistance to the arrest. Kansas law says, I do not need to get in my car and drive away because you and I are about to physically fight with each other to get you to go to jail. It is as clear as day in Kansas law. Okay? Specifically says, I do not need to retreat or desist just because you don't like going to jail. Such officer is justified in the use of any force which such officer reasonably believes, there's that word again, to be necessary to effect the arrest. And the use of any force which such officer reasonably believes to be necessary to defend the officer's self or another from bodily harm while making the arrest. That's a long way to go by saying very simply, if I say you're under arrest, okay, and you say, I'm not going with you, we have to work it out. I don't need to get in the car and drive away. I get the opportunity to make you go with me. Okay? The Constitution says that. Supreme Court case law says that. Kansas statutes say that. What it says every time is that I must be reasonable when I do that. Okay? That's the standard by which use of force is judged in a police officer action. And it goes on to say about deadly force. Where am I at here? However, sorry, such officer is justified in using deadly force only when such officer reasonably believes that such force is necessary to prevent death or great bodily harm to themselves or another person. So that's the standard. If I feel like this person's life is in jeopardy based on what someone is doing, I can use deadly force. Not only if I think he's going to die, but if he's going to suffer great bodily injury. He's getting hit in the head with a baseball bat. You're going to suffer great bodily injury. Okay? That's how that's defined in state law. And it goes on to provide some other stuff. But that's the key point of all of this. State law is clear in what I'm allowed to do. I just must be reasonable. I have a question.
So, you went through the federal law, and it's a violation, let's say, of the Fourth Amendment, if one shoots, let's say the case down in Atlanta, if one, that's not for sure, but if someone's running away and they committed a minor felony that's not life-threatening, and let's pretend there was no question that there was no weapon involved. And so it's a violation of the Fourth Amendment, just to say that it is.
Okay?
There is no punishment, though, for the officer who does that. It's just a civil violation, isn't it? There's no law that gives a punishment for violating that civil right. Am I correct there?
Typically speaking, that is settled in civil court with civil suits. There is a civil suit, and money is awarded one way or another relative to that.
But it's a civil violation of one's rights, not a criminal violation that then punishes an officer or not punishes the officer.
Right. 1 second. Separate. Hold on.
I can't
Repeat it.
Oh,
Repeat
sorry.
what you're saying. Can you repeat the question?
Sure. He went a long way to ask me what the punishment was for violating someone's Fourth Amendment rights. Okay? And typically the answer to that question is that is adjudicated in civil court with liability, civil liability. Okay? Now you can separately from being sued be the subject of criminal prosecution either at the state level in Kansas or in federal court. Okay? The U.S. Attorney's Office can file criminal charges against an officer, okay, for that, but typically that is not done in very rare circumstances. Okay? Question? Yes, ma'am.
Just following up on that is the very rare circumstance. Speak up. Sorry, usually very loud. Yeah. The very rare circumstance for criminality, is that because of qualified immunity?
We'll get to that at the very end. All right, we'll get to that at the very end. A lot of questions. Yes, ma'am.
Can you define the difference between detainment and arrest?
The question was, can I define the definition between detainment and arrest? Traditionally, detainment is a very short period of time, mostly associated with a traffic stop. Okay, that is a detainment. Okay. If, however, I'm investigating a crime and someone provides information to me that you might be the person that we're looking for, I can detain you. The length of how long I can detain you is dependent entirely on what the information that I have is. Okay? An arrest is you're not leaving, you're staying here, and very likely you're going with me to jail most of the time. That is generally the difference. Yes, ma'am?
Both of those are seizures under the Fourth Amendment.
It is only a seizure under the Fourth Amendment if I arrest you. If I actually arrest you and you are no longer free to leave. A detainment, again, it's about the time. Okay? It's about the time. And it's a judgment case one way or another. Right? Let me give you this example. I pull you over because your taillights are out. You're driving at 2 o'clock in the morning, your taillights are out. I come up, you give me some indication that you might be intoxicated, right? I can detain you for a very short period of time to investigate further, but if at some point very shortly after that I determine you're not intoxicated, I must let you go, okay? That's about the best way I can describe it off the top of my head, but let's you and I talk afterwards one-on-one about that, all right? All right. Let me move, Tony, go ahead. One more time, and then we're going to move on. Again, we're going to be here until 8 o'clock.
Right.
Okay? You're stealing all my thunder. You started a picnic.
Who determines the definition of reasonable?
That is fact-based, Tony, and it is based on a decision by the court. Okay? I make an arrest. You go to jail. You decide. You say, I don't think the arrest was reasonable. I don't think the use of force was reasonable. That is a decision by the court. The court can say, that was a unreasonable use of force. Now, I can also make that, okay, which I have before. I've decided as an employment issue, what you did was a violation of our policy, which I'll talk about in just a minute. But as it relates to being criminally or civilly in trouble, it's a judge that makes that decision to the court. All right? All right, we're going to move on. This is excellent.
Just to finish the question.
Tony, I said we're moving on.
But it's the perspective is based on the reasonable of the officer on the scene.
No, that's not true. Okay? Remember what the Supreme Court said. They gave us 4 tests.
It said the reasonableness of a particular use of force must be judged from the perspective of a reasonable officer on the scene, rather than from the 20/20 vision of hindsight. My question was, who determines what's reasonable?
The question was, who determines what's reasonable based on what the Supreme Court told us, right? It can be two, Tony. It can be me. I determined what you did was unreasonable, and it can be the court, or it can be the court. Okay? Or it can be the court. I'll talk about our policy. That might clear things up a little bit in a minute, Tony. All right? Kansas law, resisting arrest. There's a second law that covers arrest. A person is not authorized to use force to resist an arrest, which such person knows is being made by either a law enforcement officer or by a private person summoned and directed by a law enforcement officer to make the arrest, even if the person arrested believes the arrest is unlawful. Even if you think that you're being hosed by the police out on the street at 2 o'clock in the morning is not where we work that out at. Okay? We work that out in the courtroom. Okay? We work that out in the courtroom. Okay? So Kansas says, even if you're upset about it, you can't use force. You can't punch me in the face because you don't like the fact that I'm arresting you. That's a violation of the law separately. All right? We also have department policy that covers use of force. I provided it to you. Again, it's on the table. Okay? Our department's policy that covers use of force. Okay? We participate in the program called the IAC Model Policy Program. IACP stands for the International Association of Chiefs of Police. Okay? Most chiefs of police are a member of that organization. It's our professional group. Okay? They have a lot of very, very smart people that spend a lot of very, very long hours studying all kinds of policies that specifically govern law enforcement. Car chases, foot chases, mental illness, pregnancy for females, you name it. If there is a policy that needs to be adopted by a police department, the IACP has a model policy, and all we do is take it, we change IACP model policy to the Leavenworth Police Department policy, and we adopt it with a very few changes once in a while. For example, if we have tasers and pepper spray when we're talking about use of force, but another agency doesn't, they wouldn't need to include that in the policy. All right? They don't need to include that, but that's where we get all our stuff. We're not smart enough here to do our own. It's complicated. There's a lot of legalese associated with policy. We just use theirs. It's all done. They spend hours and hours studying with experts, lawyers, and all that to help us here in Kansas adopt standardized policies generally. Okay? Currently, we have 62 chapters in our department's policy that covers almost everything we do. Part of this process, once we get to the end of it, if we decide to make some changes to our department's policy, we'll do that, and then we're making them all available on the police department's webpage. Okay? It's open public record. You can come get one if you want. Okay? But we're going to do that as a matter of making them all available, and if anybody has a question, anytime. Okay? We're just waiting until this process is over with and the evaluation is complete. All right? Here's our use of force policy. The Leavenworth Police Department. Law enforcement agency that officers use only the force that reasonably appears necessary to effectively bring an incident under control while protecting the lives of the officer and others. It must be stressed that the use of force is not left to the unfettered discretion of the involved officer. This is not a subjective determination. The use of force must be objectively reasonable. That term comes from the Supreme Court, objectively reasonable. The officer must only use that force which a reasonably prudent officer would use under the same or similar circumstances. I call this the nunchuck rule. One of my favorite police officers, second only behind his wife, okay, cannot unilaterally decide today that he's going to bring in nunchucks and start using them. Okay? He can't do that. And then when he uses them, say, well, that was reasonable because I said so. Okay? The officer can't do that. Has to be department authorized, outlined use of force. Okay? He can't just bring in his nunchucks secretly and start using them out on the street because he says he's a ninja master. All right? Doesn't work that way. Okay? We all, generally speaking, have to look at it. Officers have to look at it and say, what they did was reasonably prudent. Okay? I can live with that. I might not have done it exactly that way myself, but what they did was reasonable. All right? Objectively reasonable. All right? That's the department's policy. We're going to get into some definitions now. Deadly force. Any use of force that is reasonably likely to cause death. For obvious reasons, we're talking about shooting people most of the time. That's what we're talking about. Officers shall comply with 215227. That was the state statute that governed use of force for situations regarding use of deadly force. Non-deadly force is basically everything else. I'll talk specifically about that, but it's basically everything else. Physical effort used to control or restrain another or to overcome the resistance of another. Objectively reasonable. We give a definition of what that means. In determining the necessity for force and the appropriate level of force, officers shall evaluate each situation in the light of known circumstances, include but not limited to the seriousness of the crime, the level of threat or resistance presented by the subject, and the level of threat to the community. What are we talking about? Why are we using force? Okay? What's the crime we're investigating? What happened? All of those things have a bearing on whether the officer's actions, were reasonable. Use of deadly force. Law enforcement officers are authorized to use deadly force to protect the officer or others from what is reasonably believed to be a threat of death or serious bodily harm, or to prevent the escape of a fleeing, violent felon who the officer has probable cause to believe will pose a significant threat of death or serious physical injury to the officers or others. Where practical, prior to the discharge of firearms, officers shall identify themselves as law enforcement officers. Okay? That's the policy that governs all of this. This is called the deadly force triangle. Do me a favor and think about for a minute what the Supreme Court said, the calculus of reasonableness. Okay? The calculus of reasonableness, keep that in your head while we go through this. There are three elements essentially that we're talking about. Does a person have the capability of killing you or causing serious injury? Let's pretend for a second that I am not a police officer, but I am armed. Do I have the capability of killing you or injuring you? Yes, obviously, right? Do I have the opportunity, if I am threatening this gentleman from right here and I am armed, do I have the opportunity to do that? Certainly. I have a weapon and I'm right close. Is there a perceived threat? If I'm just standing here, is there a perceived threat? Maybe, maybe. But if I say something like, I'm going to kill you, is there a perceived threat? Or if I reach and I start to pull out my weapon, is there a perceived threat? Right? Capability, opportunity, perceived threat. Let's change that for a second. I have the capability because I'm armed. I have the capability. I tell him I'm going to kill him, but I'm talking to him over the phone and he lives in Texas. Right? There's no opportunity. Not an immediate opportunity, right? While calculating those three things, you also have to keep in what we call the preclusion rule. Before I use deadly force, is there anything I could have done to preclude having to do that? All right? I've got to evaluate in a very short period of time the capability, the opportunity, and a perceived threat, all the while trying to decide whether there's anything I could have done to preclude it using deadly force. That's why the Supreme Court called it calculus. And that's why the Supreme Court said it's easy to judge what happened after the fact with 20/20 hindsight. You have to make the determination about what the officer did in terms of reasonableness based on what was happening at the time. Okay? They have to process all three of those things. Keep in mind the preclusion rule, sometimes just like that. Okay? Sometimes just like that. That is training doctrine. That's what's trained. That's what's told to the officers when they're starting to think about deadly force. Use of non-deadly force. Where deadly force is not authorized, officers may use only that level of force that is objectively reasonable to bring an incident under control. Officers are authorized to use department-approved non-deadly force techniques and equipment to A, protect the officer or others, B, restrain or subdue a suspect, C, bring an unlawful situation safely and effectively under control. Remember the term department-approved as we advance forward, okay? We have a use of force continuum that we talk about and teach. You might have heard that in the last month or so, okay? Use of force continuum. The person being arrested dictates what happens. All right? The use of force continuum is predicated on the idea that the person being arrested dictates on what happens. If I say, sir, you're under arrest, please turn around, put your hands behind your back, and they do that, we're good to go. Okay? If they don't, then we have to work it out. All right? Then we have to work it out using a continuum. Think about it like this. I'm going to put the microphone down for a second. I'm going to talk loud, though. Picture two elevators side by side. You're standing in a hotel lobby. Two elevators side by side. One represents the person being arrested. The other one represents the police officer. Okay? The police officer is always going to be one floor above, at least, or equal to when we get to the top floor, when we're shooting at each other. Okay? Two elevators side by side. Sir, you're under arrest. No, I'm not. I'm going to go up with my level of resistance. I'm not going to jail. Officer goes right up with him, staying at least one floor above. Okay? We go up, we all go up together. We come down, we all come down together. What this person does represents what the officer does. We go up together, we come down together. All right? Think about that when you evaluate the use of force continuum. All right? Here's what it is. Levels of resistance. This is the suspect. Okay? We specifically spell it out in our policy. This is what we teach and this is what we talk about. Psychological resistance. Staring at you, giving you the stink eye, clenching your fists, okay, getting a fighting stance. All of us are old enough probably to know what someone looks like when they're angry and they're, getting ready to fight. Maybe you kind of get that vibe. That's psychological resistance, okay? Verbal noncompliance. When I was much thinner and much younger, I got this one a lot. You better call for backup. You're not big enough to arrest me, okay? Got that a lot. I ain't going to jail, dude. You ain't taking me to jail. Okay? Verbal non-compliance. Passive resistance. Laying on the ground. Won't get up. I'm laying there. Put my hands under. I'm not cooperating. I'm not giving up. Okay? I'm not doing this. Okay? Escape resistance. Pulling away, pushing away, walking away, running away. Okay? Catch me if you can. I'm not going to jail. Active aggression. Punching, kicking, striking the officer. Okay? Aggravated active aggression, shooting at me, okay, trying to hit me with something, baseball bat, a weapon, something like that. Aggravated active aggression. Those describe, in generalities, resistance by the suspect or the person being arrested. Levels of control by the officer. Me simply being present is a level of control. I'm the police. I'm here to restore order. Most people understand that, right? I'm simply here. Verbal direction. Hey, you're under arrest. Settle down a little bit. Let me sort this out. Verbal direction. Okay? Verbal direction. We're going to talk about de-escalation in a minute. That's where that comes in at. Physical direction. Simply guiding you to the police car, even though you may not want to go. Yeah, you're going with me. You're going with me. OC spray. That's one of the first levels of force that we use. That's an application. Okay? Soft, empty hand control. Pressure points, wrist locks. Somebody's tussling with us a little bit. Put them in a wrist lock. Get them over to the police car. Put them in handcuffs. Okay? Hard, empty hand control. That's where we're talking about the taser. Okay? A little bit more aggressive. Striking them, like a little knee strike, something like that. They won't cooperate. A shoulder pin. I'll talk about that later. Okay? Intermediate weapon. Baton. Less lethal. That's the beanbag rounds that you've heard about. Okay? And then finally, deadly force, which is a handgun or rifle. Do anybody in here see anything remotely associated with a chokehold? There is no chokehold authorized by the Leavenworth Police Department as a department-approved technique. Understand this about what all this means. None of it matters if it is a life or death situation. Okay? For example, if a guy about 5 or 6 weeks ago stops in the middle of the Blue Bridge, gets out and starts shooting, and he gets run over by somebody, okay, that is a perfectly acceptable use of force. Okay? If it is a life or death situation, and it's clear, if the only thing that an officer can do is apply some sort of chokehold, okay, the law is going to be perfectly clear about that. It is a life or death situation. That applies to you or me or any of us in any circumstance, regardless of whether they're police or not. You get to defend yourself. The question becomes, is it really a life or death situation? Okay, the question becomes, is it really a life or death situation? That's the question everybody wants to ask, okay? All right. Force options. Communication. Most of the time, we're trying to talk our way into the guy going to jail or the girl going to jail. Okay, we spend a lot of time about that. We have verbal judo and de-escalation as training techniques. Okay, it's about a 6 or 8 hour class. Steely and Zeke are our 2 instructors. They went to learn how to teach all that stuff. We've been teaching it forever. Verbal judo was the first iteration. Okay, all the way through now it's de-escalation. All kinds of effort made to make sure police officers know how to talk to people and know how as best we can to talk them into complying with this. Okay? Pressure points, arm bars, ground fighting techniques. Okay? It doesn't do any good to know we're going to be in a physical altercation occasionally and not teach the officers how to do that and be successful in that. We teach that. Ground fighting techniques. OC spray, police baton, taser, less lethal, beanbag, rubber bullets. Okay? Police canine, SWAT team. All of those are tools in the use of force tool bag. You start at the top and you go down. The lower you get on the level, here on my list, the higher you are. Okay? We started talking and we ended shooting. That's the force options that are generally available to a police officer. I'll reiterate again. Nothing in there authorizes a chokehold. Okay? Nothing authorizes a lateral vascular neck restraint that you might have seen in the course of the last month or 2. Okay? That's a technique taught by some agencies. We don't teach that. We don't authorize that. Okay? We take a quick break here. Use of force reports. We have a policy that specifically dictates that a police officer, when they use force on someone, has to do a separate report, an entirely separate report on just the use of force. Doesn't matter about the narrative and the crime and all that stuff. We want the officers to tell us why we were using force. Here's our policy. Goodness gracious. The authority to use force carries with it the need for accountability in order to safeguard the rights of the public and preserve the integrity of the police, agency, and jurisdiction that provides this authority. That's us. As such, it is the policy of this law enforcement agency that use of force as designated therein shall be reported in a timely, complete, and accurate manner by involved officers and as prescribed by this policy. You are required to do a separate report on use of force. I want to know what you did. Other parts of it. Officers shall make immediate verbal report to their supervisor following any use of force and file a use of force report. Once in a great while you hear on the radio, person is in custody, use of force used. Okay? That's recorded in our digital law. Each officer who uses force in an incident shall submit a separate written use of force report. Not just a general catch-all. There's 6 guys there. They all use force. We do one report. All 6 of them have to do an individual report about their role in the use of force. Any officer who witnesses a use of force shall advise the supervisor and shall submit a use of force report narrative. So if you're there, that you didn't do anything, but you witness it, you're still supposed to do one. All use of force reports shall specify the actions of the suspect that necessitated the use of force, the reasons why the officer used force, as well as any suspect complaints of injury, medical treatment received, or refusal. On the table is a blank use of force report. Take a quick look at that. That's what they are right there. Earlier I talked about what the levels of resistance are and the levels of control are. All this stuff is in here. So they go through and they check. I told the person he was under arrest. He punched me in the face. I hit him with my taser. He gave up and we took him to jail. He wasn't injured. Or he received just minor poke marks from the taser. Something like that. Okay, pretty common. Pretty common. But each officer on each incident is required to complete one of these. And we keep them on file. Okay? And study them religiously. Let's talk about us as it relates to arrests versus use of force. In 2019, the Leavenworth Police Department made 1,893 arrests. Okay? That's how many arrests we made. You can see back, that's a little bit lower than normal, but that's what we did. Kids and adults. These are the use of force incident broken down by category, what we did. Go back. Verbal direction, chemical, we hit a couple people with OC spray, empty hand control, by and large, that's the most. Okay, by and large, that's the most. A little bit of tussling, a little bit of a wrist lock, some pressure points, something like that. That's our biggest, almost always our biggest use of force. Impact weapon, hit a couple people with batons last year, okay, during arrest, okay? And then pointing their weapon. Weapon display, that's important. For obvious reasons, if we shoot our weapon, that's different. But I want to know, and they're required to tell me when they pointed their weapon at somebody. Not just whether they discharged, but why are we pointing our weapon at somebody? I want to know that. They're required to do that, okay? I'll give some examples here in just a second about that. Okay, let's look at those numbers. 1,893 arrests, 139 use of force total last year, represents 7% of the time. 7% of the time when we arrest somebody, we use force. That's pretty low. That's pretty low. It's not a big number, okay? And that's pretty common. We average about 5 to 7% of the time. 93 to 95% of the time when we arrest somebody, they comply whether they like it or not, and they go right off to jail, and we're not out there rolling around. Of the times that we do, most of the time, it's right there. Empty hand control, a little bit of tussling. Okay, that's all it really takes, a little bit of tussling. That's pretty consistent over the years that I've seen as the chief of police. We just don't do it in this really, really high number. Okay, we just don't. Reporting, use of force reporting. Okay, they fill out the report. Every single one of them comes to me for review and approval. All of them. I see all of them. Now, obviously, the supervisor does right that night, and it kind of goes through, but I see all of them. I want to know all of use of force reports. I want to see them. I want to sign off on them that they're good. The Leavenworth Police Department participates in the National Use of Force Data Collection Program run by the FBI. That started a few years ago. Once a month, we submit to the FBI through the KBI, that's where it goes, and it is, okay, a report on any use of force that results in a fatality, serious bodily injury to a person, or the discharge of a firearm at or in the direction of a person. So most months, obviously, it's 0. Okay, most months it's 0, but if that were the case, we submit it. Okay, they define serious bodily injury there for you if you want to take a look at that. And right there, I gave you the link to the website. Okay. Right there, FBI.gov Services, Criminal Justice Information System, UCR/use of force, right? Okay? I don't know that they have much yet on the database because it mostly describes the program, okay? But every month for about just about 2 years now, we've been submitting that. What the FBI is doing is studying use of force nationally, okay? I'm really proud of the state of Kansas. I bet you the last time I talked to the group at the state level, something like 80 to 85% of the law enforcement agencies in Kansas are using this, are reporting their information there. Okay, and by and large, I think that's a pretty good number. Okay, by and large, I think that's a pretty good number. Feel free to take a look at that. Okay, I'm going to talk to you about the last few use of force reports that we've had. I told my staff, hey, grab the last 6 or 8 of them. I didn't randomly pick any of them. I just said, give me the last 6 or 8. And we're going to talk a little bit about it. Obviously, I can't give you names and stuff like that, but I'm going to give you some circumstances. A 39-year-old white male. We were there. The narrative part here. Some kind of disturbance. 911 call, disturbance. Hey, can you send the police? Sure. Got there. Officer heard yelling and things being broken inside, coming from the 2nd story window. Started pounding on the door, front and back, announcing that we were the police. There was a delay. A female person came to the door, crying, red marks around her neck, stated he had a gun. Okay, and it wasn't on him when she came down, but he had a gun, strangled her. Asked if she was injured. Okay, she said, he strangled me. Domestic violence, armed with a handgun, female victim strangled. Okay, that's what we're looking at. Okay, we yelled for the guy to come down, he didn't. We went up. He was located in the bed. We pointed our weapon at him. Show us your hands, we want to see where the weapon is. Took the guy into custody, put our firearm away, guy went to jail peacefully. Okay? Outraged by that? Concerned about that? Domestic violence? Armed? Female victim strangled? Right? Guy was supposed to have a gun, we pointed our weapon at him. My ruling was absolutely perfectly appropriate in that case. Bad guy went to jail, facing criminal charges. Okay? This happened like June 7th, something like that. Okay? June 7th, something like that. 41-year-old white female. Investigating a crime of battery. Someone was alleging that this person battered them. Okay? Officers got there, tried to get information from her. She wouldn't cooperate. I'm not telling you anything. Okay? Okay? They tried to move toward her to arrest her for the crime. Okay? As we approached, balled her hands up in a fist. Okay? We talked about that, right? Fighting stance. That's what she's doing. We're getting ready to resist. Grabbed her left forearm, forced her arm behind her back. She started to thrash around from side to side. Okay? Put her on the ground so we could handcuff her. Okay? She pulled away, kicking, scratching, stuff like that. Ultimately got her under control with nothing other than that. Okay? Took her to jail for the crimes. Okay? That's pretty commonplace. Simple arrest for battery, not cooperating. We had to wrestle with her a little bit. Get to the one. Where's the girl? Here we go. There's a good one. We had this girl twice in a row. Without regard to a great deal of context, we have a little bit of mental illness, and we have a little bit of homelessness mixed in here, okay? So we have a 28-year-old black female. She was at a couple of locations in our community. They did not want her there. They asked us to come remove her. We did that, and then a couple of days later, we're back with her again, okay? Trying to get her to leave the location. Where's the part? Get to the good part. I know what happened. I'm going to tell you what happened. They're trying to arrest her. She's got a dog. Okay? They're trying to arrest her. Dog's barking a little bit. The officer's like, hey, we warned you. You're not supposed to be here. The business owner, you had plenty of chances. You need to leave. Won't leave. Okay, you're under arrest. So they sort of managed to get her out by the police car. They're trying to handcuff her. She's resisting a little bit. Puts the dog down, turns around, punches the officer in the face. Okay? He's fine. Spits on him in his face. Turns and spits on the other two officers. Okay? Wrestled her around a little bit, handcuffed her, put her in the car, takes her off to jail. Okay?
The dog okay?
The dog was fine, man. It's the only question asked, right? The dog was totally fine. Right? We took the dog to the dog jail, animal control, so she can get her when he gets out. Right? Those are pretty commonplace use of force events. Okay? Punched in the face, wrestle a little bit, roll around on the ground, point our weapon at somebody. I look at those and I make rulings every day about whether the officers acted appropriately. Question from the back.
Well, I suppose in this day and age, angst about COVID might raise the anxiety level a little.
Well, does it have any bearing? Do my officers get to make a decision that someone says they have COVID? Because I think she said that too in one of her deals, right? If I were to say to you the officer did something different and more aggressive because the woman said that she had COVID-19, would that be part of the calculus of use of force? No? No? Okay. Do we have any yeses? No's? What? That's what we're forced to deal with every day. Okay? I don't want Cole and Noah and Steely and Jasmine and Zeke and Paul over there. Make sure I leave the way out. I don't want them infected by COVID. Okay? But we can't get in the car and drive away. Okay? We can't get in the car and drive away. Yes, ma'am. Question in the back.
It's not a question, it's a statement.
Statement.
I know you and I know you very well. But why did it have to be a black female? Why did the race have to come?
Ma'am, we track every single thing that we do by everything. Okay? Race, gender, age, location, where at in the community, all of those things. The time of day. Because people ask me all the time. Why do you do that? Because we get asked about that all the time. How many arrests did you make? How many traffic stops did you make? What's the percentage of race of those arrests? What's the percentage of traffic stops by race? I get asked that all the time. I don't have absolutely anything to hide, so I give it all of it. Okay? That's why. It's because I get asked about it all the time. People are paying particular attention to that. Whether you might be or not be, other people are. And so we put it out there. It's on our website right now, our annual report. Most of the stuff, the data that we have, we collect it because people ask us about that. Did I see one more hand? Question? Yes, ma'am. Go ahead, you.
Okay.
In the purple.
Along those lines, then, if you report these use of force reports to the FBI group, do you report all of the details to include race, gender, all those things that are on the report?
Those are in-house reports.
Right. So let me clarify. So that's an in-house report that we do.
Right.
We collect an awful lot of more information than the FBI asked us. The FBI only wants to know if there's serious bodily injury or we discharge a firearm. That's all they want to know right now. So whatever it is that they're asking for, we give them. Off the top of my head, I don't know if they're keeping that. I bet they are. I'll need to look to find specifically about that. I just know we report it, but it's almost always zero because we don't have, serious bodily injury or death very often, fortunately. Okay?
How many repeat offenders do you get arrested? Are any of those repeats?
A lot, right? A lot. And that's part of the equation. Officers go, we're going to this house.
Again.
We know that we're going to fight because every other time we've had to fight with this person or that person, right? It's going to be a little trouble. They work hard not to do that. They work hard to make sure that they're making those decisions based on what they do, not who they are. But yes, it's not, don't be naive. There's a lot of repeat offenders that we deal with that we know they're going to fight a little bit. Okay? Yes, ma'am.
I noticed on your use of force report
Mm-hmm.
and your policy that there are no shoulder or no neck holds, but yet on the diagram you have pressure points that do include the neck.
So a pressure point is different than a shoulder pin, okay? A pressure point is there are various nerves in and around various locations of the body, and if you apply pressure with like your thumb, okay, that creates pain, which creates compliance. What it doesn't do is cut off blood or oxygen, anything like that. Those are different. So pressure points are absolutely a valid technique that we use quite frequently, and one or two of them are in and around the neck. Okay, that's different though than a chokehold or a shoulder pin.
So then do I take it that officers are trained in anatomy?
Yeah, some of it, yeah. When they talk about pressure points, they are trained in, and this is why we're doing this particular nerve. What's it called, Steve? The brachial plexus, right? I don't do much fighting anymore, Joanne, but these boys and girls do, and we talk all about that with them. I know there's one there, what it's called, I'm old, I forgot. All right, I admit. Yes, ma'am.
Along those lines, just to continue on looking at the IAC plan, where you have your different levels, you have kind of contradictory policy when it comes to the neck. The hard, empty hand control, which I don't know if you consider, because it says open hand strikes, closed fist strikes, knee strikes, leg strikes, and it goes on to say these strikes will be delivered to the major muscle masses such as leg, arm, shoulders, and or the side of the neck. So
Right.
they're approving punching the neck. However, then later on with the non-lethal weapons, it says strikes to the head, neck, and or throat should be considered use of deadly force and is not authorized.
There is you ready?
Yes.
Okay, so the question is, a lot of discussion about the neck and the head. The question is, there is a specific technique called a brachial stun, okay, where if I hit right here, it causes disorientation. It's pretty high up on there. Later on, when you're talking about lethal force, if I'm hitting you in the head with my baton, that is considered lethal force.
Okay, so this is not the baton.
Right. With an instrument, no, it's not. It's that simple. Okay?
But I'm just, in my opinion, and I'm not a law enforcement officer, but I would say, depending on who the person is inflicting the punch, punches can be deadly, especially depending on where they're inflicted.
I agree with that. I agree with that debate that.
You know.
Right. Our response to that is very simple. If I don't teach them how to do something properly, they're going to do it improperly, and the likelihood of death is going to be greater. There is a valid technique called a brachial stun, which you hit right here. Okay, you strike right here, and it causes disorientation. It's really high up on the level. Okay, we're basically punching and fighting with each other at that point. But deadly force strike to the head is generally with a weapon, like a baton. Okay? I fully acknowledge that there's probably a difference between Zeke punching me in the face and Jasmine punching me in the face, right? Although Jasmine's pretty tough, watch out, okay? But I acknowledge that, but it also depends on what's happening, okay? Strikes, as a general rule, pretty high up on the level, okay? Right? We don't just get to strike people for no reason. Jeff, sorry, I missed you.
That's okay. How does an officer in a constitutional carry state like Kansas has not treat every situation as a deadly force potential? I mean, any type of movement to your hip could be interpreted as a deadly threat, and probably should be, but unfortunately that can cause really drastic results really quickly.
So the question was, how do we deal with things like carry concealed weapon, open carry, stuff like that as it relates to deadly force? It's all based on facts and training and judgment. Very often, a person that has a firearm that's either open carry or concealed carry, by and large, 97, 98% of the time, they can tell an officer on a traffic stop, I have a firearm with me. The conversation generally goes like this: you don't pull yours off, I will pull mine out, and we'll get the traffic stop on the way here, right? We really are very comfortable in the idea that that's how Kansas approaches guns and carrying concealed. It's just part of the lexicon, and they do the best that they can. Fortunately, knock on wood, we haven't had anything that we need to reflect back on. Okay, but I think the officers are very conscious of that fact. That happens a lot. We have encounters with people, and it goes quite well. Thankfully. Okay, thankfully. All right, let's move on. I lost my remote control on this stuff. Oh, thank you. Body cameras. Let's talk a little about body cameras. Not quite off of the use of force issue, but we have body cameras. We've had them for about 5 years now. They are expensive, cost a lot of money, but well worth it. Okay, well worth it. Probably the best investment we've had. 99.9% of it, other than the IT people, hate it because it's a management nightmare for those folks. Okay, captures everything that we do. I'll be honest with you, ladies and gentlemen, it is essentially a case where they're recording us and we're recording them at this point. It's much like Monday Night Football, where there's 27 high-definition angles of what happened. Okay? Really, that's what it is. We're recording, they're recording, everybody's recording each other. We have them, okay? Appropriate to the proper performances or official duties, where their recordings are consistent with the policy and the law. This policy does not govern the use of surreptitious recording devices used in undercover operations, like our secret camera pins, and water bottle pin cameras, and all that stuff that we got. That doesn't count. We're talking about the body cameras. You got one on? Cole, can you stand up for us? Okay, that's what one looks like right there. Everybody has one on. Okay? Thank you, sir. Officers shall wear their body-worn camera conspicuous place on their uniform, anywhere with the uniform shirt lapel to the belt, okay, as long as they can capture video. Shall activate their body-worn camera to record all contact with citizens in the performance of their official duties. Official duties include, but are not limited to, calls, traffic stops, question for officers, building searches, field interviews. Generally, if we're talking to somebody we have on, we provide an exemption for our school resource officer who walks around the school 8 hours a day. It would be very difficult to try and capture and record any value with that. So we don't make him do that, okay? Body-worn camera video may not be reviewed by the public without authorization from me or the deputy chief. I'll explain why in a minute. Dissemination of any body-worn camera video is subject to the Kansas Open Record Act and must be approved by me or my designee, okay? Generally, I approve all that stuff. The Kansas Open Record Act is this. As a general rule, all government records are considered to be open unless there is an exception created by statute. Most of what we collect is exempt, okay? Most of what we collect is exempt. Yes, ma'am?
So are you saying the body cameras aren't always on? Are they always on?
No, they are not always on. If they are driving around in their police car on routine patrol and nothing's happening, they are not on.
So where is the traffic stop?
We have cars in the camera. I'm sorry, cameras in the cars. Sorry. So, okay, so the question was, do we have, are they required to have the body-worn camera on at all times? And the answer to that was no, because if they're driving around inside the police car, they don't need to be recording the steering wheel. That's what will happen, okay? But and so then my answer, she asked about, well, what about a traffic stop? Okay, so the camera in the police car would capture the traffic stop, and then presumably the officer would turn it on before they got out and encountered the person up there. Okay?
Pre-recorded.
Right. There is also a 30-second pre-record. So let's say we're driving down the street and something happens and we're like, I wish I would have got that on camera, and they flip on the lights. It's always recording, and there's 30 seconds in it before that, because we're able to go back and get that. Okay? So in case we capture something like a cool accident or something like that. Yes?
Two very quick questions. First of all, are they required when they fill out a use of force report to also include any video of that incident?
So they will say body camera was activated and logged into the server. Yeah, usually that's
You
what.
have access to that,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
And the other thing is there any consequence of them choosing not to activate the body camera in an incident?
So they have the burden of explaining why it's not on when it should have been on. The burden is the officers, right? So if, for example, it was broken, that happens, it's a piece of equipment. As long as the equipment was, hey, it was broken, and I told my sergeant that we're waiting to get it fixed, or I'm waiting to get a new one, whatever. Right, but if it is not on when it should be on, the burden to explain it belongs to them, and if they don't have a good one, they're in trouble. Okay?
Chief?
Yes, sir?
What are the circumstances under which they're okay turning it off?
So we don't generally let them turn it off on a call for service or anything like that. What we do allow them to do is mute. Okay, there's an audio function. We do allow them to mute. So if we're talking about something internally to the investigation, okay, we let them turn it off so they can work it out. They're figuring out something. Why do we think this? You know, that kind of stuff. They're allowed to do that, mute it, but they're not allowed to turn it off generally when they're on a call. And they don't. I think most of them actually like having it on because it provides some protection. Right? It provides some protection. Again, most of what we collect, we do not release anything as a matter of practice. Okay? We don't just release it. I don't come in every day and go, I'm releasing this, this, and this, and not this, that, and that. I don't release anything. Okay? Now, people ask us all the time for it, and then we make a decision based on what the request is. Okay? Cora continued. Records which are privileged under the rules of evidence unless the holder of the privilege consents to the disclosure, my dear friend Todd Thompson, is never consents. Okay? We don't like that stuff. It's evidence. Most of what we have is either evidence or it's something like this. We get called to a little old lady who might be 75 years old having dementia. She's walking around in the front yard of her house and she might not have a shirt on or something like that. We go up. We round her up, we put her back in the house, we call the family comes and takes care of her, okay? Joe Citizen is not walking in my police station and looking at that video for curiosity. You're just not, okay? That person is provided protections for privacy, HIPAA, it might be evidence, whatever it is, okay? I don't allow that stuff to get out, okay? Because it's not for the general public. If it's evidence, it's for court. Okay? I think one time I released a video. One of my officers on the midnight shift managed spectacularly to take a plastic cup off of a skunk's head without getting sprayed. Okay? I thought that was brilliant. I put that out there. We had a little fun with it. But that's it. Okay? That's all you're going to get from us. People ask us, the media ask us, people ask us all the time, and we do not do it as a general practice. All right? The judge can order us to do it. Okay, if he finds or she finds that it's in the public interest, if he or she finds that it wouldn't interfere with any prospective law enforcement action, investigation, or procedure, okay, identity of confidential sources, okay, confidential investigative techniques, or wouldn't endanger the life or property. We've had one, we haven't. The judge said we are not required to. Yes, sir.
How long are they retained for?
Depends on what it is. Okay. If it is something simple as a traffic stop, it's usually about a year. Okay? And we have it for active on our system for a while, and then it kind of goes to a server, and then it goes ultimately off. Unless there's a pending court case, right? Then we'll keep it. If it's a misdemeanor, we keep it for a little while. If it's a felony, we keep it for 10 years. Dan, where'd you go? 5 years, right? And if it's something like a murder or a homicide, it's forever. Okay? It's forever. Those are specifically spelled out Like if we do a funeral escort, that's like 14 days, it's out of there, that kind of stuff. Very minor
That's
stuff.
a retaining a lot of data for a long time.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
It is very expensive, yes it is. But well worth it most of the time, okay? There are exceptions to the exception. The person who is the subject of the recording can come down and look at it. 95 to 100 times a year, somebody wants to come down and look at a video. Sir, I didn't run that stop sign. That's ridiculous. They come down, they watch the video, and they go to the third floor and they pay the ticket. Okay? Any parent or legal guardian of a person under the age of 18 wants to come down, hey, my son was talked to by the officers, arrested by the officers, can I look at it? Sure. An error at law. This is specific to an officer-involved shooting where the person is killed. The family gets to come down and look at the videotape, or their attorney, and we must do that within 20 days. Okay? Family gets to come down and look at it within 20 days on all of those circumstances. Okay? All right. Lots of questions about civilian oversight. Does the Leavenworth Police Department have civilian oversight? Yes, we do. We have elected city commission, 5 commissioners. They oversee the police department. They have a city manager. He's a civilian. He oversees me. He's my boss. If he doesn't like what I'm doing, he picks a new person or makes me change it. Okay? And vice versa. We have civilian oversight. Okay? We have civilian oversight. In the lexicon of discussion in the last few months, should we have a civilian advisory board specific to the police department? Okay? Let's talk about that. State statute allows for a comprehensive plan or community advisory board. However, it's specific to bias-based policing. Okay? It's specific to bias-based policing. I want to read to you what it says. This is state statute on community advisory boards. Law enforcement agencies may appoint an advisory board of not less than 5 persons composed of representatives from law enforcement, community leaders, and educational leaders to recommend and review appropriate training curricula. Okay? Training curricula. Use of such community advisory boards, which includes participants that reflect the racial and ethnic community to advise and assist in policy development, education and community outreach, and communications related to racial and other bias-based policing by law enforcement officers and agencies. Anything more than that would require a change to state law, because that's governed by state law. The last time the city of Leavenworth talked about it was in December of 2011. The state statute changed in about 2010. Everybody talked about it locally. The city of Leavenworth elected to adopt a comprehensive plan, which is also on the table for you to look at. Okay? Take with you if you want. That's our comprehensive plan that deals with things like bias-based policing. Okay? All right. Other stuff. I'm almost done. A little more than an hour. How about that? Spectacular. Police discipline. Chief, have you ever fired anybody for excessive use of force? I have, in the course of my time, fired, I've been the chief for 13 years, a total of 22 police officers. 18 of them have been probationary police officers that we evaluated and decided they were not going to make it in the law enforcement profession. Okay? One of the things that really, really irritates me, and I don't get irritated very often, is this business about this thin blue line and the cops don't tell on each other, and where's all the good cops when the bad cops are misbehaving, okay? Every single one of those 18 came at a recommendation from my staff. Chief, this guy or this girl ain't getting it, okay? They're either not safe, they underreact, they overreact, they have bias towards a person of color, they have bias towards women. They're not going to make it. We got to get this person out of here. I've done that 18 times. I have fired 4 tenured police officers, okay? Ones that are not probationary. 2 of which were for excessive use of force. 2. The other one was for domestic violence. The other guy was an idiot. Okay, let's just be clear about that. No other way to describe that. Whether or not you find that to be acceptable or not, it is what it is. Those are factual statements. Most of the time, they come from the people that I put in charge going, this person needs to be trained, we train them, we do all these different things to develop them and get them ready, and they come to me and say, sir, this one's got to go, and they go. Okay? I'm not bragging about that, that's just the way that it is. Police certification. Discussions about a bad police officer being fired from your agency and going to work somewhere else. Okay? Here's a good one, it's a big one. The Kansas Commission on Peace Officers Standards and Training certifies us. Okay? We got to go to the police academy, they certify us. We got to take 40 hours of training every year to be recertified, right? And they track our certification. Okay? Now, right there is a website called the KC Post. Okay? That's the group that certifies us. They have a database there. So if I fire somebody for excessive use of force or whatever it is that I fire them for, we report that to C-Post. C-Post keeps that in a database, okay? And when we're considering hiring somebody, we search that database. Did they ever work as a police officer in the state of Kansas? And why aren't they working there anymore? And if it was for termination because they were bad, we get to know that, okay? We get to know that. In addition to that, Major Nicodemus, is it 46 states?
45.
There are 45 states that share in that database. So, for example, if a guy was working in Missouri and got fired over there, I can check to see why they were fired. Okay? Okay? That is really, really good. I don't know which of the other few states don't participate, but by and large, I can tell. By and large, we can tell why a particular officer left one particular agency and wants to come to work for us now. Okay? That's really, really helpful. I can just tell you that most of the time now, police chiefs and sheriffs just don't do that. It's not worth it to hire somebody that's been fired. Okay, we don't do that. It creates liability. Why are we taking on that baggage? We just don't want to. If it is for any reason associated with lying, we can't use them in a criminal case anyway. Our colleague, Mr. Thompson over there, won't call them as a witness. They're not reliable. Okay, we have to report. There's just no sense in doing it anymore. It was true 5 or 10 years ago. It's just not true anymore, especially in the state of Kansas. We just don't do that. That's very helpful. Okay? Now, C-Post, somewhere in this mess, has something called an integrity bulletin. Every year they give us a report on who they decertified. Okay? 2 times last year. You do not have the integrity bulletin. You need to find that on the website up there. Sorry. Okay? I ran out of paper. We copied a lot of stuff today. Okay? Last year, the state of Kansas C-Post decertified 2 police officers for excessive use of force. Okay? They got in trouble, they got reported, and they were criminally charged. Okay? And then they were also decertified by the state of Kansas, which means they were no longer allowed to be police officers. Okay? It happens. It may seem like it's rare, but I see that as a good thing. It shouldn't be very often that we have to do that. When we do, we do. But it shouldn't be something that's very often. Okay? No-knock search warrants. You've heard a little bit about that in the lexicon. No-knock search warrants are almost impossible to get, but they are authorized. Okay? We do have a policy. I will tell you, the last time the Leavenworth Police Department did one has to be 8 or 9 years ago. It's a drug case. The guy, we believe, was selling all kinds of drugs, had all kinds of weapons, had surveillance equipment to determine and make decisions about if the police happened to come, and the confidential informant that we sent in to buy drugs said the guy had a hand grenade. Okay? We applied for and got a no-knock search warrant for the judge because we don't want to get shot or blown up by a hand grenade. Okay? We got it. We went in. He, in fact, had all kinds of weapons. He, in fact, had a hand grenade. He, in fact, was selling all kinds of dangerous drugs and went to prison for a little while. Okay? It's authorized. It's really, really hard to get. We don't do it very often. But if we're thinking about changing that, I would just offer that as an example of how it was used appropriately, and perfectly necessary in the course of that circumstance. Okay? Qualified immunity. This is going to be a big one. We probably will fight about this one. I'm not budging off of qualified immunity. I'm opposed to changing that. Here's why. First of all, nobody in this room, including me, has the authority to change qualified immunity. That is a decision by the Supreme Court. Okay? The Supreme Court of the United States created that. Here's the way I feel about it. It is protection against a standard of perfection. When we are using force on someone, we are arresting them based on absolutely everything that everybody's ever experienced and said. There's absolutely no way in the world that we can be perfect. It's just too hard. The Supreme Court described it as calculus. Because it is. It's hard. It's dangerous. It's complex. And if the standard is perfection, we've already failed. We're never going to be perfect. Qualified immunity is designed to protect a police officer doing everything they can in an impossible situation from making a mistake, the outcome then being, I'm going to arrest them and send them to prison for the rest of their life. That can't be the standard. It's too hard. The guy in Minneapolis is not going to get qualified immunity. Okay, there are circumstances in which an officer is acting in the best interest of everybody and still makes a mistake. They cannot be perfect. They can still be in trouble. They can still be sued. But not every officer gets qualified immunity who does something wrong. It is a standard by which, okay, we provide some level of protection, so we ensure that the standard isn't perfection. It just can't be. Nobody has that standard. Doctors don't have it. Nobody does. Okay? I'm not budging off that. I'm just not. If the Supreme Court changes it, then they change it. That is the only thing I will not change my mind on. Yes, ma'am?
If somebody gets sued, a police officer gets sued, who's done something very egregious, and they lose, does the police officer have to pay that, or do the taxpayers pay that?
So generally, it's the insurance company that pays that. Obviously, the taxpayers pay the insurance premium and that sort of thing. Okay? Very rarely that I can ever remember does anybody other than the insurance. Now, obviously, the city's capped at a certain level, so anything beyond what the insurance covers would be the burden of the taxpayers. But as a general rule, those decisions almost every time are driven by the insurance companies about how it's going to proceed. Is it going to go to trial? Is it going to be settled? What's the settlement going to be? Those kinds of things.
And there's no, I presume, no thought that some police officers might want to buy their own insurance.
Police officers, as a general rule, do have their own liability insurance, okay, through the local organization that they're a member of. They pay a small monthly fee, and that way, you know, if something like that happens, then they have some protection from, you know, being able to afford an attorney and that sort of thing. Okay? Yes, ma'am.
Along those lines, and I know we have quite a few, I don't know if we have the active duty military, but I know we have retired military in here, so correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't believe if you are deployed and on the battlefield that you have qualified immunity if you kill somebody who you shouldn't have. Am I right or wrong with that?
Well, I mean, you're under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, you can be prosecuted by the military, but I mean, it's a different situation. It's not completely analogous, but there are, you know, kind of standards of reasonableness and proportional force. You can't just, you know, if you're in a battlefield, you can't go around killing anybody. It's, you know, if you're threatened, you know, it's according to rules of engagement established by the military.
Right.
And comparing police officers every day to a uniformed military person in a battlefield situation, completely apples and oranges. Very, not even almost remotely the same. So that, I think, is generally the end of my presentation. I went a little longer than I thought. If there aren't any more questions, I'll be glad to answer questions individually in the group setting, but I also create, oh yes, sir?
Two questions for you. My name is Paul Conway. I live in the county. I have almost no interaction with the Leavenworth Police Department.
Well, we can work on that.
First off, and this is a stupid question, so bear with me. As I understand it, the essential part of community policing is that the same officer patrols the same neighborhood, gets to know the people know him, and therefore would build up trust. Now, is that practical in a city the size of Leavenworth? And the second question for you is, how much of your officers' time and attention is taken up with mental people that are really not criminals, but are just causing problems to themselves? And I think like Anthony Dunkel, for example, that are just a pain in the butt for everybody else. They're harming themselves, but I mean, you have to deal with them because we don't have a whole lot of mental health going on.
Right.
That's my question.
So the question was two-part. How do we deal with community policing? Quite easily. Yes, that's the philosophy. You sort of described it pretty closely to accurate, which is you want the same officer working the same part of town, you know, as consistently as you can. We do our very best to try and do that. It does help. The officers do know who's supposed to be where and what they're driving and that sort of thing as a general rule. Okay? Leavenworth is not huge, so most officers are able to know most of the town anyway, so that works fairly well for us. As it relates to mental illness, yep, takes a bunch of our time. I'm not in a position to name names, but I will just tell you that about 150 calls a year, if I remember right off the top of my head, which is about once every other day, we're dealing with some sort of mental illness call, whether it's a direct threat of suicide or, off their medication and drinking, something like that. It does take quite a bit of our attention. It is dangerous. Prior to the COVID situation, there was a lot of work being done to try to improve the infrastructure to help us deal with that, and that got set aside for the COVID-19 for obvious reasons. But at some point when the world returns back to normal, we'll probably turn our attention to that and try and get some help on that. Okay? Jeff?
Thanks for letting me ask so many questions too.
I know, right? You got one more.
I know.
Okay.
So I'm a big advocate for what the man is advocating for, community policing as a community function, because if you look at your escalation matrix there, it's easy for somebody who has a bad attitude about the police to easily get into verbal altercation and physical ready-to-fight mode. Without some kind of consistent, interaction, we have citizens who grow up in a counterculture sometimes, and without police inside of that as a force that's not just inflicting order, but also building community, it can cause us to have, some factions to get more and more aggressive towards the police, right?
Right.
Mixed with that, the fact that I think we have quite a bit of turnover with our pay rates of the police officers, right? If we could increase some of our pay rates as a city and have people stick around longer, I think, in the younger ranks, that could actually have positive impacts and, merge that with community involvement, right?
I am excited about a giant pay raise for the cops, sir. I'm excited about that. So, we do. What frustrates me about that, Jeff, is this group of cops and kids do a spectacular job, generally from a day-to-day basis, but we don't go around telling everybody about it, okay? We don't. They play baseball with kids in the neighborhood. They stop and cut somebody's grass who's having a mental health day, right? They do that a lot. We just don't go around telling everybody about that, because that's not the way that cops generally are wired. It's only when we're in big trouble that we get generally the most attention, which is okay, right? Which is okay. You have to judge, the community has to judge how well we're doing in the endeavor of community policing. Okay, I can stand up and tell you all day long that I'm Aquaman, but that ain't mean I'm Aquaman, okay? I need community's input to tell us how we're doing on that, and by and large, I think we're doing okay, right? We're not perfect, I'm not arguing that. I think by and large, as it relates to community relationships, engagement with the community, all these different things that we try to do on purpose, I feel like we're okay in that regard, with the obvious that we're not perfect. Sir, Commissioner Preisinger.
Hi, I'm Mark Preisinger. I've been on the commission for a little over 11 years, and I know about, Chief, you can correct me, I think about 7, 8 years ago, we first started the discussion on body cameras, and the whole commission was not for it. I know I was for it, the commissioners for it, we slowly got enough commissioners to go for it, to go for the, lack of a better term, a GoPro, and I know it's more than a GoPro, but that's what it has. And the cost, the initial cost of each camera, as I remember, is approximately $500. So about $50 up to $25,000, call it that. But the amount that we're spending every year in storing the data, Mr. Kramer's here, Chief Nicodemus, Chief Kitchens, $400 grand?
Probably, it might be $500,000 now.
$500,000 just to store it. And we were one of the early police departments in the state to do it. For example, Overlook Park, the second largest city in the state, does not use body cameras. They're discussing it now. I know the chief, both Chief Kitchens, Chief Nicodemus, has advised them they're going to put in $100,000 in their budget to store it. And they told them that you better think like, $2 million or so to store it, because that cost is very, very high. But these body cameras are one of the biggest things that we've done in the last 7 or 8 years. Not the only thing the police department's done, but it protects the police officers and it protects the public. And it's very important that we keep this program up. It is very expensive. And I'll say something about qualified immunity that maybe the chief didn't want to say, or maybe missed. Police officers do have qualified immunity, but it can be challenged. A recent case right here in Leavenworth, the judge makes the final determination. Does that police officer have qualified immunity? On a case that's possibly the elephant in the room, the judge did rule 2 weeks ago this officer does not have qualified immunity. So just because you term qualified immunity doesn't mean that an officer can go out and rob banks on a shift and come back and go back to work. The way his qualified immunity can do that. It is presumed, but it can be taken away, as does happen. So,
All right, Commissioner, did you think?
Yeah, I have something. Just could the city manager, and I know the turnover of personnel turbulence is a challenge for all police departments, I think, but this commission, going back several years, has made it a priority to look at pay and benefits and to try to keep up with other departments in the local area. And I'd just like Mr. Kramer to kind of confirm that some changes were made a few years ago to keep our police officers and to get compensated at a rate that would, you know, not lead to as much personal turbulence as there was maybe 4 or 5 years ago. Is that a true statement, Mr. Kramer?
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Mayor. I'll address compensation, I'll address turnover. So one thing that Pat does and HR does when we talk about collecting data is we collect why does an officer leave. And I'll let Pat talk about this because he's been in this field a lot longer. It's not just better pay now. It's completely different career fields. It's competing jurisdictions, whether it's the Highway Patrol, whether it's USP. I mean, there are different places that people go. And so I think part of the challenge is addressing pay, but also addressing a different generation of young officers. Directly related to pay, I don't know any firefighters in the room, we put a STEP program in place for the police department. They're the only department in the city that has that because we recognize that they are different. This is a different job than the rank and file city employees. There's different risks, there's different value to the community in having a full police force at all times. So it's based on achievement, it's based on tenure, time in the police department, but it's also based on certain benchmarks they have to have. We also just 2 years ago completed a classification and compensation study which looked at every other comparable unit, police department unit in the state, about 22 agencies, and we're phasing that in over, I think we're going to phase that in over 4 years. That includes not just the officers, but it includes starting pay. So when you look, we're never going to compete with Overland Park for starting pay because well, until COVID, they had essentially endless funds. But what we can do is we can be competitive with the competitive jurisdiction. So I think about that all the time. Pat talks to me about that every time we meet. So definitely something that we continue to push for. So we can keep these officers here in Leavenworth, the ones that know the community and they feel like they're valued members of the team.
How high is the turnover rate? I guess I'm surprised because I feel like I see the same thing.
That's just me. So I think last year was like 11 police officers left off the top of my head. I have it, but it's probably higher than normal. But that is applicable to all the police departments. I talk all the time with Chief Wayman and Sheriff Dedeke, you know, all the jurisdictions in Leavenworth County and, you know, Kansas City. It's the same everywhere. It's just competition is lethal. It's tough, and you know, we do the best we can. So, Mr. Thompson, I think, was next, and then Joanne, and then Mr. Proctor.
I just want to clarify. I'm Todd Thompson, the county attorney. We keep clarifying. Qualified immunity is a civil matter. Immunity that you were talking about is immunity for a criminal matter. So they're two different things. Qualified immunity is protection from reasonable mistake. So I just want to make sure that's clarified for everybody that they're two separate issues.
I will not be silent. I just want to say, you know, first of all, I want to thank the young men and women in your police department because I will say that every encounter I've had in 23 years that I've been in this community, it's been a positive encounter with our police force. You guys came out and supported the Unity Walk. That was amazing. The community was able to see you and show that we can work together. I'm a strong proponent for an advisory council because it allows the community to know our peacekeeping officers. And that's what they need to see you as, not just police, but peacekeeping officers, and have relationships with you, and also see you as human beings. Because I think the average young kid in school only see TV, movies, or they see a few resource officers, and hopefully many of them only have positive encounters with our resource officers. But I really think you need to know them, and the community needs to know you. So that's why I advocate for an advisory council.
Yeah, I wanted to say one more thing about your question about the difference between the battlefield and community policing. When if I deploy to Iraq, I get on a plane, I go to Iraq. I'm there for a year. I know my life's in danger, and I get on a plane, I come back here, and I'm in the relative safety of the United States. These men and women every day, because of community policing, they live in the communities that they police, and every day they walk out the front door, there is the potential that they could be threatened with the use of force. And so the amount of responsibility that we keep on the shoulders of these folks and the decisions that they have to make every day, I just couldn't even imagine what it'd be like to have to walk out the door every day and make those decisions.
Absolutely.
And in a small community like Leavenworth, it's the same when you're in uniform or out of uniform.
Yeah.
Every day. When we get up in the morning, we'll check our mail.
Ms. Dittman?
So speaking more of what you said, you mean at 17-year-old in high school, kids are always like, oh, we don't like this person only because it's what's going on right now. They only see what's going on right now. So I hear you. I'm sorry. Me being a 17-year-old in high school, being around my peers, they don't like the police. Like, that's the only thing they see. They see what's on the media, they see the shows, things that she said, in my event, bringing us all together, that showed, like, they're here for us. But not enough people saw that. Not enough people saw the unity of the community walk. Not enough people saw what we saw. So it's so important that you guys go out and be involved. If people are playing basketball in the streets, I'll shoot a hoop with them, say, oh, good shot. It's just so important that you go and show that you're here for us, because my generation, my age of kids, they don't see that, So I'm like so for what she said. It's super important.
Thank you very much. Well, why don't we do this? We save time for one more question back there. Then after that, we'll wrap up the formal part, and you can hang around and visit with the officers, introduce yourself, meet them, talk with them, ask them questions about how awesome I'm doing. Right, Cole? Your evaluation's coming up in a couple weeks, and beyond that. Who was back there? Right over there. Yes, ma'am.
Hello. So I would like to second what she was saying about the younger students, like the younger people, because I think the only couple of police officers that I really had interactions with was you, but I also is the same grade as your son, so they're around for things. And then the person who taught our DARE curriculum. So I think just being around maybe for more events with young students who are kind of still learning about what the police are, what the police do, kind of the function in society, because right now is a tough time, but it's always kind of been a tough time to even figure out what it is, what any of it is.
Right.
Also, my other question was, do you know if there's a large proportion of the people use that, I don't have the PowerPoint in front of me, but the code that you guys use, that the research one that you guys just have adopted, that organization that does that, do a lot of police forces use that, or is that
So you're talking about the IACP model policy?
I believe so.
So the question is, does a lot of agencies use that? I think so. Most of the agencies that I'm aware of in Kansas rely on that as a very valuable tool. Again, they have a lot of very smart people who spend a tremendous amount of time studying that and the impact of it, and they make it available. I think most people at this point, agencies in Kansas use that. All right? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and then can we find anything about who uses those, or
Yes.
other states?
I will find out who uses that. If you would see us afterwards, so I can get some communication from you, or to communicate that to you, I will find out. The question is, how many law enforcement agencies use IACP model policies?
Yeah.
Okay, great. I will find out. Let me close with this statement, okay? The point of all of this was to listen, okay? We now know, I think you have an in-depth knowledge of what our policy is and use of force and all that stuff. What I want you to think about at this point is what changes you want, okay? Ms. Schultz advocated for a community advisory board. If you heard something you want to think about changing, we need to know that. Okay, communicate that to us, okay, so we can consider that as part of the process. Do we want to change that? What are the implications of that? So, because that's part of the process of this community engagement. We'll have another one, okay, in August. I think it's August 8th at the St. Mary's Pavilion out there, the gym, and Saturday morning. You guys are all invited to come back. If you have different questions, something like that, please feel free to do that. So we'll close the formal presentation at this point. We will be here for as long as you want, except for I think Steely has to work at 9:30. The rest of us will be here and answer questions, whatever that you might have. Thank you very much for coming. I'm looking forward to continued engagement. Thank you.